Suur tänu, Ülle, ja austatud daamid ja härrad. Jah, ma kõigepealt tegelikult tahtsingi öelda, et mul on niisugune hästi kohmakas, tõsi küll täpne tiitel omistatud, aga transpordist ma loomulikult rääkima ei hakka. Et palju lihtsam oleks vist olnud siis, kui oleks lihtsalt olnud seal taga, et Henrik Hololei IRL-i liige ja sellega on kõik ära öeldud. Ma austusest meie külaliste vastu olen oma kõne ette valmistanud inglise keeles, nii et see on selles mõttes heaks tasakaaluks Toomas Schneiderile, kes ennem sakslasena pidas oma kõne eesti keeles. Ja ma alustan tegelikult ka ühe tsitaadiga, ja mis pärineb 60 aastat tagasi, ja mis on täna juba korra siin ekraanil olnud Jeff Fountaini poolt ennem peetud väga huvitavas ettekandes. Ja see on siis suure internatsionalisti ja mõtleja ja visionääri Robert Schumani tsitaat, mis siis kõlab nii, tsitaadi algus: The European spirit signifies being conscious of belonging to a cultural family and to have a willingness to serve that community in the spirit of total mutuality without any hidden motives of hegemony or the selfish exploitation of others. These words are as relevant today as when Robert Schuman said them in 1949 when he was French foreign minister and Europe was still emerging battered and bruised from the Second World War. A few years before that, in a speech made in Zurich, with which I'm sure you are also familiar, another very great man, Winston Churchill, was the first to float the idea of creating a United States of Europe, where small nations would count as much as large ones, contributing to the common European cause. This is what lays the basis for European cooperation and expresses the values that are dear to the European project also today. Churchill was not suggesting that Europe should build a political establishment identical to that of the other side of Atlantic, which in turn, of course, at times got the inspiration from Europe itself. But he was referring more to a dream of peaceful cooperation and prosperity, which was, of course, most valued after the Second World War, where people of all countries could feel at home. Something rather like what we enjoy in Europe today and have learned to take for granted. And President Pöttering was also in his speech before talking about this feeling at home. Since that time, Churchill's dream has driven the hopes and expectations of European integration, of forging a strong European identity, today extended soon to 28 nations. But what does that mean? What actually binds Europe together? Does a collective European spirit or soul actually exist? Despite today's strong economic and political currents pulling us in different directions, some towards fragmentation, others towards greater unity, the answer remains the same. All these decades later, having built successfully on the original aspirations of Europe's founding fathers, remain bound by a shared sense of value. Ladies and gentlemen, in Europe we have a long tradition of democracy and pluralism. While we have many different traditions, cultures and languages, 23 at last when I counted, and I think soon 24, we also have many common values that need to be defended. The European Union is now home to more than 500,000 people from very varied ethnic, cultural, linguistic backgrounds spread over a large landmass. The EU's own motto of united in diversity is, I believe, more valid today than ever. It's also not too far from the one used for our cousins in the United States, whose own coinage features the phrase e pluribus unum, out of many one. Granted, in Europe, we do not emerge as a single nation from our 27 member states. We have not quite become the United States of Europe that Churchill had in mind. But we do strive to be a positive melting pot of countries, cultures, and people with a single and strong voice in the world stage. In that, I think, we have been pretty successful, also being the most prosperous region in the world. A global player pursuing a political vision inspired by values of freedom, justice, and solidarity, and pursuing a middle ground of accepting diversity. These qualities are particularly close to my heart, not only given Europe's checkered and occasionally violent history, but more in the sense of willingness to accept and include. Tolerance, in a word, a key part of the European spirit, whose roots are founded on Christianity, by far the most prominent religion that has shaped European culture. This distinctly Christian foundation, as well as the cultural and religious ties that bind Europe to each other, are the glue keeping all our different national societies together. They help to secure both peace and prosperity. These are our roots, core values, and shared heritage, the strength that underpins European society. Of course, this doesn't mean that Europe is a closed club of Christians. We have always demonstrated our openness to absorb and welcome other people. But at the same time, we should not forget or be ashamed of who we are. To so exaggerated tolerance in the Christian sense can sometimes push us far away from our origins in our desire to be inclusive, that we become terrified what might offend others, like wishing season's greetings and not Merry Christmas. Nevertheless, it is a delicate balance that we need to achieve, to welcome and include, but also to stay true to our European selves and not to retreat from it. For us Estonians, the main attraction at the time for joining European Union was the idea of living in freedom, in security and in peace. As Eastern European part of Europe trapped behind the former Iron Curtain and under the control of the others, we had lived for so long behind closed fences and walls. When Estonia joined the EU in 2004, what other freedoms did we want? Well, we wanted freedom of expression, religion, thought, information, knowledge, elections, free trade, free competition, freedom to buy goods and services. This had all inspired us to get there. These are also the very principles that are the foundation on which the EU, societies and economies has been built over the decades. Ladies and gentlemen, while diversity is important, unity is perhaps even more so. We promote cooperation and understanding among the peoples of Europe, looking for unity while preserving and rejoicing our wealth of difference. Imagine how much has changed in attitudes and awareness from 100 years ago, when we knew relatively little about each other's countries and cultures, and perhaps weren't so interested in learning. This is how today we can demonstrate our common European identity and spirit. And I think that a good point was also made before by Jeff Fountain when he said that Robert Schuman should be taught at every school in Europe, at least as a basis of this European cooperation for people to understand. Because Europe has achieved an enormous amount since Schuman's own 1950 declaration, which gave birth to what we now know as the European Union. It has delivered more than half a century of stability, peace and prosperity based on Europe's ability to forgive and forget. This ability was fundamental for allowing the European project to start all those decades ago, and of course we still need it today. Here I would like to recall the recent 50 years anniversary of Franco-German friendship, the Élysée Treaty, milestone of reconciliation that placed us firmly on the path leading away from acrimony and towards European alliance. There were different then, and naturally still are today, and not just between France and Germany. De Gaulle wanted a Europe of nations. Adenaueri wanted more federalism. Some ideological differences exist today as well. Same ideological differences exist today as well. At the same time, the strong relationship, the desire to work together to overcome differences for a greater good of Europe and Europeans has enabled us all to achieve, at the same time, remarkable success. Living standards have been raised steadily, and let's not forget that Schuman's historic call for countries to pool their coal and steel production came just 5 years after the war, when many countries were struggling to rebuild their shattered economy and social fabric. And reconciliation was not the prevailing trend in the societies, but it was the right thing to do. One could ask, do the politicians withstand that scrutiny? We should ask today. More recently, we have built a single pan-European market and launched a single currency. Both of these are important elements and symbols for our joint European identity. In economic terms, at least, we have buried the most divisive of our historical rivalries. That's all part of being together in the same boat. And going back to the Christian values, it's very much a case of help thy neighbor. This is what the European cohesion policy has been about. We saw this principle reinforced in the 2007 Berlin Declaration to mark the 50th anniversary of the signature of the Rome Treaties. The idea that Europe is striving for, quote, mutual respect and shared responsibility, unquote, based on the European Union's foundation, quote, on equal rights and mutually supportive cooperation, unquote. Of course, Europe continues to face unprecedented challenges, particularly today's economic difficulties with a single currency and debt crisis in several EU countries. Unemployment, especially among youth in countries like Spain and Greece, is a very serious worry, and not only there. More than half of the young people are out of work. At times like these, it can be difficult to maintain a sense of the shared European values of freedom, humanism, and tolerance. These values are being increasingly challenged by rising nationalist populism in many EU countries. There is a good deal of delusion among citizens around the very idea of Europe. Politicians dare less today to do things because they are the right things to do. These are the key values that are the visionary backbone of a society of durable peace and common prosperity, but that can only be sustained in a world that is open-minded to all different systems and civilizations. Today, the EU is generally understood as being a composite entity that combines unity and multiplicity. One of its cornerstones is also the European citizenship, which gives a sense of belonging in the European community. John McCormick, a well-known political scientist and writer on European affairs, wrote about the concept of European citizenship in his 2010 book, Europeanism. He argues that to associate with a European set of values, it is important for defining an identity. Quote, the balance is changing, while it is not yet possible, legally speaking, for a European to renounce citizenship of a state and to become a citizen of Europe. There is a new sense in Europe that it is both possible and desirable to associate, not just with states and nations, but also with a larger idea of Europe, with an emerging European consciousness and with a set of values that are quintessentially European, unquote. Neither have we shied away from expanding our borders to embrace new countries and cultures. The EU's recent enlargements have clearly contributed to Europe's diversity, but also its strength, but also in diversity and strength in economic, cultural, and political terms. Just under 10 years ago, there were 15 member countries, now soon to be 28. That means a focus has had to shift towards even better mutual understanding across our vast region, above and beyond consensus building. It's about the recognition of difference, interaction and dialogue, being inclusive, not exclusive, all within a highly diverse society based on shared European values. And we should at the same time not to forget the cultural and spiritual background that we come from. Ladies and gentlemen, it hasn't always easy to steer a steady course while speaking with one voice. But Europe is holding strong. The European Union has showed itself able to come together and act in the interest of Europe as a whole. That is our strength, massive strength. It's based on the fundamental principles at the heart of the European project, which are also the building blocks of European integration. These are, in fact, the soul and spirit that bind Europe and Europeans together. Thank you very much for your attention.